Close your eyes for a moment if you'd like. Imagine a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind where the sun filters softly through lace curtains, and the only sounds are the rustle of leaves outside and the gentle creak of a rocking chair.
And the Lord,
A candle
in
might be
his
glowing
infinite
nearby,
wisdom,
or perhaps the
shall
faint
guide
warmth of a
us
fireplace
through
wraps the room in a
these
kind of hushed
trying
stillness.
times.
You breathe in and the week's noise seems to fall away. It feels like a day meant for rest, yet surprisingly, in certain times and places in American history, even the act of resting was something regulated, and in some cases even forbidden. Tonight, we step into the curious world of blue laws, those sometimes strict, sometimes downright peculiar rules that dictated what people could and could not do on Sundays. Among them were laws so oddly specific that they even banned napping on the Sabbath in some towns. Yes, you heard that correctly. There was a time when falling asleep on a Sunday afternoon might have landed you in trouble. To understand how such laws came to be, we must drift back centuries to the early seeds of colonial America, where religion, governance, and daily life were so intertwined that one's private choices often became matters of public concern. The phrase blue laws itself has a rather mysterious origin. Some say the name came from the blue paper on which early Puritan laws were supposedly printed. Others argue it derived from the word blue as in strict or moralistic, similar to calling someone blue-nosed. Whatever the etymology, the term came to describe a wide body of regulations designed to enforce religious standards, especially the sanctity of the Sabbath. The Sabbath, for devout Puritans of New England, was not just another day. It was the Lord's Day. From sundown on Saturday to sundown on Sunday, life was expected to be devoted entirely to God. The world outside might have been fields, markets, and workshops, but on Sunday, time itself was supposed to change. No farming, no trading, no drinking, no dancing, no traveling. Activities that might seem mundane on other days were forbidden on the Sabbath. And for some lawmakers, that even included the idea of rest that was not explicitly religious, like napping. It may sound contradictory at first. Wasn't Sunday meant to be a day of rest? Yes, but within the Puritan worldview, rest had a very particular meaning. It meant resting in God. It meant quiet reflection, prayer, church attendance, reading the scriptures. To fall asleep in your chair or to doze away a Sunday afternoon was seen by some leaders not as holy rest, but as spiritual laziness, a neglect of sacred duty. One of the earliest places we find such restrictions is in the colonies of New England during the 17th century. Connecticut, for instance, became famous or infamous for its extraordinarily strict set of laws. A 1650 document, often called the Code of 1650, listed in detail what citizens could and could not do on Sundays. Activities like cooking, sweeping the yard, or even playing a musical instrument could be punished. Some accounts claim that one town ordinance even scolded those who dared to sleep through the Sabbath day, whether during a church sermon or at home in the afternoon. Picture it. A warm summer Sunday in a small Puritan town, the sermon stretching into its second or even third hour. The church windows stand open, letting in a faint breeze. A farmer, weary from the week's labor, lets his head tilt forward just for a moment. His eyelids grow heavy, but if he slips too far into slumber, a sharp-eyed deacon may prod him awake, or worse, issue a reprimand for violating the spirit of the law. In some congregations, special officers known as tithingmen carried long poles, one end tipped with a feather, the other with a hard knob. The feather was for gently tickling a drowsy woman awake. The knob was for rapping a sleepy man back into attentiveness. This was no laughing matter to them. For Puritan leaders, discipline was the glue that held society together, and any breach of Sabbath rules threatened not just the individual soul, but the moral order of the entire community. If the Sabbath slipped, so too might faith, and if faith slipped, so too might the colony's very survival. It's worth pausing here to consider why early Americans were so strict about such things. The colonies were fragile experiments, small outposts surrounded by wilderness dependent on unity in order to thrive. For many settlers, religion was the compass that gave their lives meaning and their communities cohesion. The Sabbath laws were not seen as an inconvenience, but as a lifeline to divine favor. To keep God's blessing, the community had to be vigilant.
Oh, it's closed.
Yet, from the very start, blue laws also sparked controversy. Travelers passing through Puritan towns were often shocked at the restrictions. Later historians too looked back with both fascination and skepticism. The laws seemed at once admirable in their devotion and absurd in their severity. The idea of punishing someone for dozing in a pew struck many as overreach, even comical. By the 18th century, blue laws were evolving. The strict Puritan code softened as colonies became more diverse, welcoming Anglicans, Quakers, Baptists, and others who had their own views of Sabbath observance. Still, many Sunday restrictions lingered. Taverns often had to shut their doors, shops were barred from opening, and work was still curtailed. But in some regions, the prohibition against napping remained a curious reminder of earlier zeal. We should also remember that enforcement varied widely. In one town, the rules might be harshly applied, with fines and public shame for violators. In another, they might be more symbolic, laws on the books that no one truly bothered to enforce. Local culture mattered greatly. One telling anecdote comes from New Haven, Connecticut. Take another slow breath with me. Imagine yourself on a Sunday morning in the late 1700s. The air is cool and the town square is still. Wooden shutters cover the shop windows and the hammering of blacksmiths has gone quiet. No carts roll down the dirt road. No market stalls open their wares. The world feels paused, as if even time itself has been asked to rest. In this hush, church bells ring out, summoning the faithful. This was the atmosphere shaped by blue laws in early America as the colonies moved into the 18th century. Though the strict Puritan codes of the 1600s were softening, Sunday laws remained a powerful presence. And as the colonies edged closer to independence and the creation of a new nation, these rules told a deeper story about community, morality, freedom, and the struggle to balance them. By the 1700s, the American colonies had become a patchwork of cultures and religions. Quakers in Pennsylvania, Anglicans in Virginia, Catholics in Maryland, Baptists, Methodists, Jews, and freethinkers of every kind, all lived under the same expanding sky. Each had its own traditions for worship, rest, and daily life. Yet the idea of setting Sunday apart persisted across many communities, though it was enforced differently depending on where you were. In New England, where Puritan influence remained strongest, the laws could still be surprisingly strict. Tavern owners were fined for serving drinks on the Sabbath. Farmers faced penalties for laboring in their fields. Even travel was discouraged. A person riding their horse unnecessarily might be stopped by local authorities. And though enforcement of anti-napping rules had become more symbolic than common, the message remained clear. Sunday was a day for solemnity, not for leisure. Meanwhile, in the South, where the Anglican Church had more influence, blue laws often reflected a blend of religion and social order. Church attendance was expected, and businesses were restricted. But in plantation culture, where enslaved people labored 6 days a week under brutal conditions, Sunday sometimes became the only day they could gather, rest, or worship in their own way. This created a strange duality. Sunday was enforced as sacred by law, but for many enslaved Africans, it was also a day of cultural survival, a chance to sing, pray, and hold on to traditions that laws could never fully erase.
Let us reflect
as the colonies began to push against British control,
of this
the question
day.
of freedom was on every tongue. Patriots cried out for liberty in politics, in trade, and in thought. Yet even as they spoke of rights, many still held tightly to laws that restricted personal choices on Sundays. This was not hypocrisy so much as it was a reflection of how deeply woven religious custom was into everyday life. To many, freedom from Britain did not mean freedom from God, or from the community's responsibility to uphold sacred time. After independence in 1776, America found itself balancing old traditions with new ideals. The Constitution enshrined the principle of separating church from state, but blue laws endured. They were often justified as civil regulations meant to protect public welfare, rather than as purely religious decrees.
But if we do the shopping
Supporters
now,
argued
we'll
that
have more
everyone,
time
whether
later.
Christian, Jew, or skeptic, benefited from a universal day of rest. The laborer, one early 19th century writer declared, must not be robbed of his Sabbath. Still, the tension remained. Who decided what counted as proper rest? For some, like devout churchgoers, true rest meant prayer and worship. For others, it might mean a nap under the shade of a tree, a quiet walk, or even a social gathering. This difference in interpretation gave rise to constant debates and, at times, enforcement that seemed almost absurd. One traveler in the early 1800s described being stopped on a Sunday for whistling while
What
walking
is the
through town.
state's reasoning
The
for
local constable
prohibiting the
warned him
sale
that
of
music,
alcohol on
even so
Sundays?
simple as a whistle,
Your Honor,
was
the
disturbing the
state
Sabbath.
believes that this
Another
restriction
account tells
is
of families
crucial.
fined for cooking meals considered too elaborate for a Sunday table, as such effort was deemed labor. And scattered reports suggest that, in some New England villages, the spirit of forbidding naps still lingered. Drowsing during church service was not only frowned upon, but occasionally punished, as if sleep itself were a rival to devotion. This period also saw the rise of reform movements that reshaped American life, and blue laws became part of their story. The early 19th century was a time of great revival, known as the Second Great Awakening. Preachers filled tents and fields with thunderous sermons, urging Americans to repent, reform, and renew their commitment to God. Out of this movement came campaigns for temperance, abolition, and, yes, Sabbath observance. The American Sabbath Union, formed in the early 1800s, lobbied to strengthen Sunday laws. They argued that without strict Sabbath rules, society would drift into chaos. Sunday rest, they claimed, protected families, preserved morality, and even supported the health of workers. A day of prayer and stillness was, in their view, the anchor of civilization. Not everyone agreed. Business owners, particularly those in growing cities, saw Sunday laws as obstacles to profit. Immigrant communities, many of whom had different traditions, such as Jewish Sabbaths on Saturday, resented laws that seemed tailored only to Protestant customs. And ordinary citizens sometimes found the laws simply intrusive. Why, they asked, should a man be fined for buying a loaf of bread on a Sunday or for taking a nap in the afternoon? These disagreements made blue laws a recurring subject of both comedy and controversy. Newspapers poked fun at the strangest restrictions, while reformers thundered that laughter was proof of society's decay. The very term blue laws began to take on a mocking tone, suggesting rules that were priggish, outdated, or ridiculous. Yet, despite mockery, the laws endured, and even expanded in certain states. New York, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and others passed statutes that closed shops, halted stagecoaches, and restricted entertainment on Sundays. In some places, playing games, whether cards, dice, or even baseball, was forbidden. The Sabbath, they insisted, was not for fun but for reverence. Think of the irony here. A farmer who worked 6 exhausting days, rising before dawn, might long for nothing more than a nap on Sunday afternoon. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a quiet Sunday morning in a small 18th century New England town. The air is crisp. The church bells toll softly in the distance and smoke curls lazily from chimneys. Families move quietly along the cobblestone streets, dressed in their best clothes, making their way toward wooden meeting houses. Yet beyond the sound of bells and shuffling feet, the town is hushed. Stores shuttered, workshops locked, and taverns closed. Even laughter among children seems subdued, for everyone knows that Sunday is different, and the laws of the land demand it. This was the lived reality of blue laws during much of America's early history. Everyday restrictions by the late 1700s and early 1800s, blue laws had become an established feature in many colonies and later, in the young United States. They extended far beyond simply attending church. On Sundays, a whole spectrum of daily activities was restricted. Commerce, shops, markets, and even roadside stalls were forbidden to trade. Buying or selling goods on the Sabbath was considered both illegal and immoral. Entertainment, horse races, cockfights, theater performances, or even musical gatherings were outlawed on the holy day. Labor. Farmers were expected to keep their plows still. Blacksmiths let their forges cool. Fishermen did not cast their nets. Recreation. Activities that today we consider leisurely, like playing games, dancing, or traveling for pleasure, were prohibited. The idea was simple. The Sabbath should be reserved for worship, reflection, and rest. But the enforcement could sometimes feel suffocating. Imagine a weary farmer who had spent the entire week breaking his back in the fields. Sunday might have been his only chance to nap in the sunshine, take a slow walk with his children, or mend a fence that was falling apart. But if he was seen napping in public, or working to patch his fence, he could face a fine, or worse, public shame. Public punishments. One of the most striking features of blue laws in earlier centuries was the way they were enforced. Violators were not always quietly fined. Sometimes they were punished in ways designed to serve as a warning to others. For example, In Connecticut, those caught working or engaging in prohibited leisure on a Sunday could find themselves placed in the stocks, a wooden frame that locked their feet or hands in place, left to sit in the town square while neighbors walked by. This public humiliation reinforced the seriousness of keeping the Sabbath. In other towns, offenders were forced to pay fines that could amount to several days' wages. Repeat offenders might even face time in jail. While these punishments might sound extreme, they reflected the belief that Sabbath breaking was not just a personal failing, it was a threat to the moral health of the entire community. The irony of rest here lies a fascinating contradiction in blue laws. They were designed to enforce rest, yet in many ways they created stress. People feared being caught in small acts of disobedience. Take the example of napping. To us today, a Sunday nap is almost a symbol of relaxation and rest. But in some parts of colonial and early America, idly sleeping in public on a Sunday could be taken as disrespect toward God. A man who dozed under a tree while others marched to church might be fined for his laziness. Rest was allowed, but only if it fit within the religious framework of attending church and quietly reflecting on Scripture. It is no wonder that some critics of blue laws began to argue that they went too far. Instead of promoting true rest and freedom of conscience, they seemed to bind people with chains of rigid rules. Blue laws and politics. By the early 19th century, blue laws began to intersect with political debates in the United States. The young nation was expanding, cities were growing, and new waves of immigrants, many of them Catholic and Jewish, were arriving. These groups did not necessarily observe the Sabbath in the same way as the Puritan founders. For instance, Jewish communities observed Saturday, not Sunday, as their holy day. Catholics, too, had different traditions around worship and leisure. Yet blue laws continued to enforce Sunday as the official day of rest. This raised questions about religious freedom and fairness. Some politicians began to argue, should the government really be telling people how to spend their Sundays? Wasn't that a matter of personal conscience protected by the Constitution? On the other side, religious leaders and conservative lawmakers insisted that blue laws were essential to maintaining moral order in the rapidly changing republic. They feared that without them, society would slide into chaos and immorality. The debate was fierce and ongoing. Industrialization and new tensions. The 19th century brought another layer of complexity, the Industrial Revolution. With factories churning and railroads expanding, the rhythms of daily life began to change. Factory workers often toiled 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. For them, Sunday was the only chance for rest. But instead of treating the day as sacred, many workers longed to spend it in recreation, playing ball, going for walks, enjoying a drink, or simply sleeping late. Employers and lawmakers, however, still pushed for strict Sabbath observance. This clash between traditional blue laws and the realities of modern industrial life created constant tension. Newspapers of the era reported frequent arrests of workers who dared to play baseball on Sundays or drink beer in public parks. In fact, baseball itself became a central battleground of the blue law debates. By the mid-1800s, the sport was exploding in popularity, but in many cities, Sunday games were banned by law. Police were sometimes sent to break up games, dragging players off the field in front of angry crowds. Fans and players alike resented these restrictions, arguing that Sunday was their only free time. One commentator of the era wryly noted, "It is better for a man to play ball on Sunday than to lie in the gutter drunk on Monday." Yet blue laws often prevented even the harmless version of leisure. A divided nation by the late 19th century, the United States had become a patchwork of blue law enforcement. In some areas, particularly in the South and New England, Sunday restrictions remained rigidly enforced. In other regions, especially in the growing Midwest and West, enforcement was far more relaxed. This division mirrored larger cultural tensions in America, between rural and urban life, between old traditions and new freedoms, between religious orthodoxy and secular modernity. For some communities, blue laws were a badge of moral pride, a sign that they were keeping the faith of their ancestors alive. For others, they were outdated relics holding back progress and personal liberty. Take a slow, steady breath and imagine the shifting world of the early 20th century. The glow of gas lamps was giving way to electric light. Cities buzzed with trolley cars and automobiles, while factories roared with machines. Sundays still brought quiet streets in many towns, but change was in the air. The rhythms of modern life pressed hard against traditions that had guided Americans for centuries. And the blue laws, those age-old rules guarding the Sabbath, stood at the center of this cultural tug-of-war. In the first decades of the century, small towns across America still reflected the Sabbath customs of earlier times. A visitor walking through a town in Ohio or Massachusetts on a Sunday morning might have seen rows of shuttered shops, empty sidewalks, and families filing into white-steepled churches. Children's laughter was hushed and games were tucked away. Trains might run less frequently and saloons were firmly closed. Yet, even as towns upheld the old ways, the growing cities told a different story. Urban life was more diverse, more restless, and less willing to pause. Immigrants brought with them new traditions. Jewish families observing the Sabbath on Saturday, Catholics attending Sunday Mass but often enjoying recreation afterward. The cultural mosaic of America was widening, and blue laws began to feel less like shared moral rules and more like an imposition of one group's values on another. Perhaps no symbol of Sunday rebellion better captured the mood of early 20th century America than baseball. By now the national pastime, baseball had woven itself into the fabric of American identity. Working-class families who labored long hours 6 days a week cherished Sunday games as their only opportunity to watch their heroes take the field. But in many cities, blue laws forbade Sunday sporting events. Police would raid ballparks, players were fined, and sometimes games were called off mid-inning. Still, fans kept coming, often by the thousands, and pressure mounted against the old restrictions. In 1917, the Pittsburgh Pirates famously defied the law by staging a Sunday game. The police responded by arresting both managers and several players. The crowd jeered as officers marched the athletes away. Newspapers quickly picked up the story, sparking national debate. Was it really criminal to enjoy a baseball game on a day of rest? Gradually, city by city, the laws began to crack. By the 1920s, Sunday baseball was legal in much of the country, though not without fierce opposition from church leaders who warned that America was losing its moral compass. If baseball tested the edges of blue laws, alcohol threw them into the center of national politics. For centuries, blue laws had forbidden taverns from opening on Sundays. With the rise of the temperance movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, these restrictions were seen as part of a larger moral crusade against alcohol itself. When the 18th Amendment was passed in 1920, ushering in prohibition, blue laws suddenly looked like a smaller piece of a much bigger puzzle. The entire nation was now dry, at least on paper, and Sunday restrictions became part of an even stricter culture of control. Yet the reality was far messier. Speakeasies, secret illegal bars, sprang up across cities, often doing brisk business on Sundays. Police raids were common, but enforcement was uneven. In practice, many Americans used Sunday not as a day of worship, but as a day of escape, sneaking into back rooms to drink, dance, and defy the law. The irony was not lost on the public. Blue laws had been meant to enforce rest and morality, but in the Prohibition era, they often fueled rebellion and corruption. Another major force testing the limits of blue laws was the rise of the automobile. By the 1910s and 1920s, cars gave ordinary Americans a freedom of movement their grandparents could scarcely imagine. Families could now pile into a Model T on a Sunday morning and drive out to the countryside, the beach, or even into the next town. But this newfound mobility clashed with the rigid stillness of traditional Sundays. Religious leaders frowned at the sight of Sunday drivers clogging country roads, picnicking in meadows, or relaxing by lakes. Some towns attempted to ban Sunday driving altogether, though such rules were nearly impossible to enforce. Over time, the car itself became a symbol of liberation from blue laws. It allowed people to escape the watchful eyes of their neighbors, to drive beyond the borders of their towns and counties where different rules might apply. The automobile widened the gap between tradition and modern leisure. As blue laws continued to stir debate, they increasingly found themselves challenged in the courts. Immigrant communities in particular argued that enforcing Sunday rest was a violation of their religious freedom. Jewish shopkeepers who closed their stores on Saturday for the Sabbath often found themselves at a disadvantage. Forced to shut down again on Sunday by law, They lost 2 full days of business while their Christian competitors lost only 1. Many Jewish merchants brought lawsuits arguing that Sunday laws unfairly discriminated against them. Courts often upheld the laws, ruling that they were not purely religious but rather served a secular purpose of ensuring a universal day of rest. Yet the tension never disappeared, and these debates planted seeds that would grow much larger in the mid-20th century, when the U.S. Supreme Court would revisit the issue. By the time the 1920s and 1930s rolled around, the blue laws had become a cultural dividing line. On one side stood those who clung to tradition, fearing that loosening Sunday restrictions would lead to moral decline. On the other side were modernists, immigrants, workers, and younger generations who wanted freedom to enjoy their Sundays as they saw fit. This divide mirrored broader cultural battles of the time: the clash between rural and urban values, the Scopes trial over evolution, the emergence of jazz and dancing, and the rise of women's independence after gaining the vote. Blue laws were just one front in America's larger struggle between old and new. The Great Depression of the 1930s added another layer of complexity. With unemployment high and poverty widespread, many communities grew more lenient. Sunday markets and sales were tolerated because they brought much-needed business. Families who struggled all week long sometimes relied on Sunday to earn or save a little extra. And yet, even as enforcement waned in some places, in others it remained surprisingly strong. In parts of the South, Sunday still meant closed stores, quiet streets, and stern sermons. In deeply religious communities, blue laws continued to symbolize faithfulness and discipline. By the eve of World War II, America was a patchwork of Sabbath enforcement, strict in some places, relaxed in others, and fading fast in the booming cities. The early 20th century had revealed the limits of these laws. They could control time only so far before the pressures of modern life, new cultures, and personal freedoms began to bend and reshape them. Take a deep breath and imagine the quiet hum of post-war America. The 1940s had ended with victory and relief, and the 1950s brought a wave of prosperity. Soldiers had returned home, new families were forming, and the suburbs began to spread across the landscape like never before. Driveways filled with shiny cars, televisions flickered in living rooms, and shopping malls started to rise as temples of modern consumer life. Yet even in this booming, forward-looking society, the old question of Sunday still lingered. What should Americans do with their day of rest, and how tightly should the rules of blue laws still bind them? For many, Sunday remained a sacred pause. Churches were fuller than ever in the 1950s, especially in the growing suburbs where faith communities gave identity and belonging to new neighborhoods. Families dressed in their best clothes gathered for worship and returned home for large family meals. In such moments, the Sunday quiet of earlier centuries still felt alive. But around those rituals, pressure was mounting. Malls wanted to open, supermarkets wanted to sell, and families with more money in their pockets than ever before wanted the freedom to spend it, even on a Sunday. This period revealed a striking tension between tradition and modern consumerism. On Saturday nights, parking lots filled with cars as shoppers stocked up before Sunday closures. Store managers posted signs warning customers that doors would remain shut the next day. For some, it became a minor inconvenience. For others, a sign of outdated laws holding back progress. Young couples with busy work schedules wondered why they couldn't buy groceries on Sunday afternoon. Children gazing at closed toy stores wondered why their weekend pleasures were being regulated by rules written long before they were born. As television became the new centerpiece of American homes, another kind of quiet settled on Sundays. Instead of crowded sidewalks or busy main streets, many families spent the day together in front of the flickering screen, watching baseball, variety shows, or the latest news. It was a kind of compromise. The blue laws kept shops and businesses closed, but families found entertainment and connection in other ways. Yet even television highlighted the cultural divide. Some church leaders complained that Sunday programming lured people away from worship, while others saw it as a harmless form of family time. Legal challenges also grew sharper in these decades. Jewish and Seventh-day Adventist merchants continued to argue that being forced to close on Sundays was unfair. They had already observed their own Sabbath on Saturday, and being required to shut down again on Sunday often left them struggling financially. In some states, they risked fines or even jail if they defied the rules. Their lawyers argued that such laws violated the principle of religious freedom. Courts, however, often repeated the same reasoning that had been used for generations, that blue laws were not about religion, but about providing a shared day of rest for society. This distinction between religious intent and secular purpose became a defining theme of legal battles in the mid-20th century. The fight wasn't just in courtrooms. Ordinary citizens increasingly voiced their frustration. Newspaper editorials debated whether closing a gas station on Sunday was reasonable or simply absurd. Some states prohibited hunting on Sundays, which infuriated outdoor enthusiasts who worked all week and only had one day free. In other regions, restrictions on movies or theater performances led to arguments about freedom of expression. Every rule seemed to spark its own rebellion, as Americans balanced respect for tradition with the pull of personal freedom. The rise of the automobile added yet another twist. Families who couldn't shop on Sundays still used the day for leisure. They drove to beaches, state parks, and highways that stretched further every year. Picnic baskets were packed, radios played in the background, and Sunday slowly transformed from a day of stillness into a day of mobility. The car gave Americans the ability to escape the blue laws of their own towns by simply driving into another. If one county banned Sunday alcohol sales, another might allow it. If one city's theaters were dark, another's might be glowing. The patchwork of regulations encouraged people to move, to seek freedom in the next town over, undermining the authority of local restrictions. By the 1960s, the debate reached a new climax. America was changing fast. Civil rights struggles, generational divides, and cultural revolutions made questions of personal freedom more pressing than ever. In 1961, the U.S. Supreme Court finally weighed in decisively. In a series of cases, the court ruled that Sunday closing laws were constitutional. The justices acknowledged that the laws had religious roots, but they declared that their modern purpose was secular, to ensure a uniform day of rest for all citizens, regardless of faith. This ruling gave blue laws a kind of legal shield, but it did not end the controversy. If anything, it stirred it further, because the gap between legal reasoning and cultural reality continued to widen. Across the country, resistance grew louder. Civil liberties groups argued that forcing businesses to close was government overreach. Immigrant communities continued to push back, noting that what was called a universal rest day was really just a Christian tradition in disguise. Meanwhile, consumers voted with their feet. States and towns that relaxed blue laws saw an immediate surge in sales and tax revenues, while those that held firm began to feel economic pressure. The American economy, always hungry for growth, had little patience for closed doors. Still, the persistence of blue laws in many regions was striking. In the South, Sunday quiet continued to be a mark of cultural identity. Churches remained powerful voices in communities, and local leaders often resisted change, arguing that protecting the Sabbath was about more than economics. It was about preserving a moral way of life. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a Sunday morning in the 1970s. The world feels different from just a decade earlier. The quiet streets of the 1950s have given way to a society that pulses with new rhythms. Rock music blasting from radios, shopping malls rising like cathedrals of commerce, and political movements reshaping what freedom and equality mean. Against this backdrop of change, the old blue laws stood like relics, stubbornly trying to hold back a tide that seemed unstoppable. By now, many Americans had grown accustomed to working 5 or 6 days a week, and Sunday felt precious. Yet it no longer felt simply like a day of church and rest. It was a day to shop, to wander, to gather, and to enjoy the leisure that prosperity had made possible. Shopping malls in particular became the symbol of this new era. By the mid-1970s, there were thousands across the United States, drawing families with promises of everything under one roof: food courts, department stores, toy shops, even arcades for restless teenagers. But in many states, those malls could not open their doors on Sundays. The contradiction was almost comical. Gleaming monuments of consumer culture standing empty one day out of every week. Store owners lobbied relentlessly for change. They argued that closing on Sundays was costing them dearly, and that modern life no longer allowed for a universal day of rest. Customers, too, were frustrated. Many households had 2 working parents by the 1970s. and weekends became the only time to take care of errands. Saturdays were busy enough. Why should Sunday be artificially off limits? The argument gained strength as the American economy itself shifted, becoming more dependent on service industries, retail, and non-stop commerce. Resistance, however, was fierce. Church leaders still fought passionately to preserve Sunday as sacred. They warned that if blue laws fell, Sunday would become just another day of consumption, stripping away the last quiet space from a restless, noisy world. For many pastors, the fight was not only about faith but also about community. They feared that once Sundays were consumed by shopping trips and work schedules, families would stop gathering, neighborhoods would weaken, and the bonds of shared rest would unravel completely. Local governments were often caught in the middle. On one side were business owners eager for profits and consumers eager for convenience. On the other were clergy, tradition-minded citizens, and sometimes labor unions that feared constant Sunday work would erode hard-won protections for employees. In many states, the compromise came slowly. Courts chipped away at restrictions, legislatures loosened bans, and enforcement grew patchy. By the late 1970s, the map of America looked like a strange quilt. In some regions, Sunday was just another day of business. In others, it was still marked by shuttered stores and empty main streets. Even as these laws weakened, they continued to provoke cultural battles. Liquor sales were often the most hotly contested. In some states, the sale of alcohol remained forbidden on Sundays long after other restrictions faded. For critics, this was proof that morality still shaped legislation. For defenders, it was a line worth protecting, a symbolic reminder that Sunday should not be drowned in indulgence. To this day, echoes of that fight remain, as many states still ban or restrict alcohol sales on Sundays. The 1980s accelerated the unraveling of blue laws. Ronald Reagan's America was a place of booming consumer confidence, rising malls, and an almost celebratory embrace of capitalism. Sunday shopping became an increasingly normal expectation, and the arguments for keeping restrictions seemed weaker with each passing year. Families who once had only Saturday for their errands now could split tasks across the weekend. Teenagers working part-time jobs often welcomed the extra shifts, and for big-box retailers, opening on Sundays meant enormous profit. Still, nostalgia clung to Sundays. For some, the memory of closed towns and hushed afternoons remained powerful. Older generations spoke of the peace they once knew, the sound of birds instead of traffic, the slow rhythm of family meals instead of checkout lines. Writers and social critics began to mourn what was being lost, arguing that without blue laws, Americans were surrendering the last sacred pause in their hurried lives. Some communities even voted to keep partial bans, not out of strict religious belief but out of a desire to preserve a slower pace. The patchwork nature of blue laws became even stranger in these years. You could drive across state lines and find a completely different Sunday reality. In one county, you might buy a six-pack of beer at noon. In another, the store shelves would be roped off. In one city, the mall would be bustling with families. In the next, its parking lot would sit empty, a silent reminder of an older order. Travelers often found the inconsistency confusing, even amusing. Yet in its way, it reflected the broader American story, a nation that prized both freedom and tradition, often in conflict, often in compromise. As cable television expanded in the 1980s and sports broadcasting exploded, Sundays took on yet another meaning. Football games became national rituals, drawing millions of viewers. Some saw this as a replacement for the communal rhythms once built around church. Others saw it as a continuation, another form of shared experience. Either way, it shifted how families spent their Sundays. Blue laws, once intended to enforce rest, were increasingly out of sync with the rhythms of modern leisure, where entertainment, shopping, and sports defined the day. The 1990s pushed the issue even further. The rise of globalization and 24/7 commerce meant that Sunday closures felt archaic in a world that never slept. The internet was just beginning to reshape shopping habits, but even before online retail took hold, Americans were embracing a culture of constant availability. Sunday sales became not only normal but essential. Imagine a quiet Sunday morning in the early 2000s. The air is filled not with the tolling of church bells, but with the soft hum of computers, the gentle clicking of keyboards, and the faint glow of screens that connect millions of people across the world. A new kind of revolution was underway, one that would reshape not only how we worked and played but also how we spent our Sundays. The rise of the internet meant that for the first time in history, commerce no longer depended on the clock or the calendar. Stores could be closed, malls could be shuttered, but the online world never slept. This new reality made blue laws feel increasingly irrelevant. After all, what was the point of keeping a shopping mall closed on Sundays when customers could simply log on to Amazon, eBay, or other early online marketplaces and buy whatever they needed with a few clicks? The irony was striking. Laws designed to protect a day of rest could no longer stop the flow of commerce because commerce itself had escaped the boundaries of brick and mortar. The world was now open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and Sunday was no exception. For many Americans, this change felt liberating. Parents with little time during the week could order groceries or gifts without worrying about store hours. Workers on tight schedules found that Sundays no longer carried the same frustrations they once did. The convenience of digital shopping turned Sunday into a new kind of day, a day of multitasking, where leisure and consumption blended seamlessly. A person could attend church in the morning, relax with family in the afternoon, and order a week's worth of supplies online before the evening news. Yet this convenience also raised deeper questions. Was something vital being lost in the process? Critics began to argue that the rise of 24/7 commerce created not freedom, but a new form of restlessness. Instead of one day of pause, society now encouraged constant engagement. Sundays were no longer a respite from the world's demands. They had become another day in the endless cycle of consumption, emails, and alerts. Blue laws, in their odd and archaic way, had once protected people from themselves, forcing them to slow down, to step back, to breathe. Without them, the pace of life seemed to accelerate relentlessly. Some states continued to enforce remnants of their blue laws, particularly around alcohol sales and hunting. These restrictions stood out sharply against the backdrop of digital freedom. You could not buy a bottle of wine at a local store on a Sunday morning, but you could order a case online and have it delivered to your doorstep a few days later. You could not hunt deer in some regions on Sundays, but you could spend hours hunting for deals online. The contradictions highlighted how much the world had changed and how stubbornly old laws could linger. The early 21st century also brought a new focus on work-life balance. Americans were working longer hours, often tethered to smartphones and laptops even on weekends. Studies showed rising stress, burnout, and mental health concerns. Against this backdrop, some began to revisit the old logic of blue laws not as religious mandates but as tools for wellness. Was there wisdom in carving out one day each week where the world slowed down? Could enforced rest be reimagined for a digital age? Not as prohibition, but as protection? In Europe, some countries experimented with similar ideas. Germany, for example, maintained strict regulations on Sunday store openings well into the modern era, defending the day as a cultural treasure rather than a religious duty. Their example sparked conversations in the United States, though few lawmakers seriously considered reviving blue laws. The American spirit of individual freedom and free market capitalism seemed too strong, too resistant to anything that looked like restriction. Still, in quieter corners of the country, people longed for a slower pace. The Great Recession of 2008 added another layer to the story. As businesses struggled to survive, many pushed harder to maximize every possible sales day, including Sundays. Closing doors even once a week felt like a luxury few could afford. In that climate, the remnants of blue laws eroded further. Customers demanded convenience, businesses demanded revenue, and governments needed the tax income. The cultural weight of Sunday restrictions, once unshakable, seemed lighter than ever. And yet, even as blue laws faded, Sunday retained a special aura in American life. It remained the day most associated with family meals, church services, and shared rituals. The explosion of professional sports made Sunday a centerpiece of entertainment culture, particularly with the dominance of the National Football League. In its own way, football became a new Sabbath, drawing tens of millions of viewers into a collective experience that, while secular, still bound people together. The screen replaced the pulpit, but the rhythm of gathering endured. Technology continued to reshape Sunday. By the 2010s, smartphones allowed people to carry the world in their pockets, blurring the lines between work, leisure, and commerce. Apps offered food delivery, rides, shopping, and streaming at all hours. Blue laws, once written in heavy volumes of colonial codes, seemed almost laughable in an era where a swipe of a finger could deliver instant gratification. What once required a sheriff to enforce now seemed impossible to regulate at all. Still, the memory of blue laws refused to disappear completely. In documentaries, essays, and conversations, older generations recalled the quiet of Sunday towns. Writers painted nostalgic portraits of empty streets, quiet porches, and the sound of nothing but birds and breezes. Some asked whether America had lost not just laws but a rhythm that made life more humane. In a society increasingly plagued by burnout and exhaustion, the memory of enforced rest began to look less like oppression and more like wisdom. A surprising twist came with the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. As lockdowns swept across the nation, Sundays, and indeed every day, fell quiet in ways that had not been seen in decades. Streets emptied, malls closed, and commerce slowed dramatically. For months, Americans experienced a kind of enforced rest, though it was born of crisis rather than tradition. The silence reminded many of the Blue Law era, when Sundays carried an unshakable stillness. Some found it calming. Others found it unsettling. But it sparked fresh conversations about what a balanced life should look like, and whether modern society had tilted too far toward constant motion. By the time the pandemic eased, blue laws remained only a scattered remnant. Picture yourself once more in that quiet space, perhaps near a window where the afternoon light streams softly, or beside a lamp glowing gently against the stillness of the evening. Take a slow breath as we bring this story to a close, tracing the strange and winding path of laws that once tried to dictate what Americans could and could not do on a Sunday. These blue laws, which began as stern commands from colonial governors and Puritan preachers, carried across centuries, shaping rhythms of life in ways that still echo today. When we look back, what stands out most is not just the rules themselves but the reasons behind them. Early settlers believed they were carving out not only a new country but a holy experiment, a place where society could be ordered by spiritual discipline as well as civil law. In their world, Sunday was sacred, and blue laws were the walls built to protect that sanctity. The harsh punishments, fines, stocks, even jail, may seem extreme now, but to them they were a necessary guardrail against chaos. To rest was not merely a choice, it was a duty. As centuries turned, those laws evolved. They shifted from being about salvation to being about society, from serving the church to serving the common good. In the 19th century, when cities swelled with workers and industries roared with activity, Sunday became the one day of pause, a chance for weary families to gather, for silence, to reclaim the streets. Even for those who cared little for religion, Sunday offered something priceless, a guarantee of rest. And so the laws endured, though their meaning had shifted. But no law can stand forever against the tide of change. The 20th century introduced machines, cars, airplanes, and finally screens that turned the world into a place of constant motion. A society that once stopped on Sundays now learned to expect everything to be available always. The debates about blue laws grew fierce. Were they unfair restrictions on freedom and commerce, or were they gentle reminders of something deeper, something we risked losing in the rush toward progress? Courtrooms rang with these questions. Politicians sparred over them, and citizens voted to keep or repeal them. Each state, each community made its own decision. By the dawn of the 21st century, most blue laws had faded, their remnants scattered like old stones left from a crumbling wall. And yet in their absence, a curious thing happened. People began to miss what they had once resisted. They longed for quieter Sundays, for moments when the world slowed down. Some turned to personal rituals, Sunday walks, family dinners, screen-free afternoons, as a way to reclaim the calm that laws once enforced. Others discovered it during moments of crisis like the pandemic lockdowns, when the world itself suddenly imposed stillness, reminding us of the forgotten rhythm of rest. What makes blue laws such a fascinating story is not whether they were right or wrong, but what they reveal about us. They tell of a society forever torn between motion and pause, between freedom and restraint, between the need to achieve and the need to simply be. They remind us that laws are not only about order but about values, about what a people choose to honor and protect. For centuries, Americans chose to protect Sunday in one way or another. Even now, long after the laws have slipped away, Sunday still feels different. Its hush, its rituals, its lingering weight remind us that culture leaves deeper marks than statutes ever could. As we close this story, consider the paradox of those old laws. They began as restrictions but became, in their way, gifts. By forcing people to stop, they gave them space to breathe, to connect, to rest. In a modern world that never stops, perhaps the lesson of blue laws is not that we need more laws, but that we need more intention. We need to remember that time is not just something to fill, but something to protect. So if you ever find yourself on a Sunday morning, whether in a bustling city or a quiet town, pause for a moment. Notice the slower rhythm, the empty streets, the soft hum of a world catching its breath. Think of those centuries of Americans who lived under the shadow of blue laws, sometimes resenting them, sometimes cherishing them, but always shaped by them. Their world may seem distant, but their struggle feels familiar. The search for balance in a life that pulls us in every direction. And maybe, as you rest, you'll smile at the irony. For in telling the tale of laws that once forbade rest, we find ourselves remembering the importance of it. In the end, that may be the truest legacy of the blue laws, not the restrictions they imposed, but the reminder they left behind that every society, no matter how fast or free, needs its moments of stillness. As the glow of this story fades, imagine again the flicker of a candle, the hush of leaves outside, or the gentle crackle of a fire. Let those sounds and images carry you into rest, just as blue laws once carried a nation into pause. The story is complete, but the rhythm it speaks of continues and echo across centuries, reminding us that time, when honored, becomes more than minutes. It becomes meaning.